Grace and peace, my friends, and welcome to GB102 Bible Backgrounds, a course where we will discuss the historical, geographical, political, social, and cultural settings of the Old and New Testament. In this orientation presentation, we will discuss all of the essential aspects of this class. Specifically, we will cover the course syllabus, some of our class expectations, assignments, and policies, and, of course, all the due dates for graded components of the class. So, if you're ready, strap yourself in because we don't have much time and this train is going to have to leave the station. And so we should probably begin by noting that you are taking this class in what is called an online format. And you should be viewing this lecture in an online service known as Moodle through the macuniversity.edu web domain. So if you are viewing it through Moodle, congratulations. You are successfully viewing the course materials on what is called the LMS, or the Learning Management System. And all of the course materials will be available via this website. However, if you're watching this video on a different website, like YouTube for instance, you will not be able to get to all of your classroom materials that way, and you'll need to hop on over to this web address, http://moodle.macuniversity.edu. And once you're there, you'll want to fill out your username and password, and that'll get you online. It should be similar to your username and password that you use to access your Mid-Atlantic email. And if you discover that you're having difficulties accessing the Learning Management System, or the LMS, you'll want to dial the MacU Help Desk at area code 252-334-2014. So, hopefully you are now logged on to the LMS, and we can start with some of the introductions. My name is Dr. Corey Allen, and I'm the designer of this class. As such, you'll be hearing my voiceover on the majority of the class lecture videos. But with all that being said, I may not be the professor at Mid-Atlantic Christian University who is selected to teach this particular section of the class. And so, you'll want to begin by making contact with your instructor and introducing yourself to them. To do this, you're going to want to click on the Community Introduction Forum and make a post about yourself. Follow the basic prompts and give your name, your college major, and 5 interesting facts about yourself. Your professor should do the same in this forum, and so everyone will get to know a little bit about everyone else before the class ever gets started. You should also take note that we've got a couple other forums that you'll want to visit from time to time. Forums such as the Open Forum, where you can freely chat with your peers, post prayer requests, and post questions about assignments and other just topics of interest in general. But you'll want to specifically take note of the News Forum, and you'll want to get in the habit of checking that forum daily, as your professor will make important class announcements in the News Forum there. So now, once you've introduced yourself to your professor and your classmates, now we can talk about this class that you've signed up for. According to the school catalog, this class is a study of the historical, geographical, political, social, and cultural settings of the Old and New Testament. This course seeks to provide students with a context that will enhance their understanding of biblical text and promote further biblical studies, as well as affirm the historical reliability of the scriptures. Gee, and all that just for 3 measly credit hours. So, if I may attempt to put this into layman's terms for a second, this class, we will discuss history, geography, and cultural settings of the Bible, and will present the material in an orderly fashion so that you'll be able to see the connections between these 3 different fields of study. My goal, ultimately, is to help you use this information so that you can read the Bible better. Additionally, our course catalog states that this class is a 3-semester-hour class, and what that translates to is approximately 135 total hours of work for the semester. Now, this wouldn't be so bad if the class was spaced out over 16 weeks over the full semester, but it's a shortened format, and we only have 8 weeks to play with. And this means that you're going to have to average about 17 hours of work per week in order to keep up with all the assigned readings, listening to the lectures, posting on the discussion boards, and working on your projects. And yes, this is the equivalent of a part-time job, so you will have to manage your time very, very carefully if you're going to complete all of this classwork. Or, if I may put it more bluntly, This online version of GB102 Bible Backgrounds is even more intense and demanding than the in-class version because it will cover the same amount of material and it has the same amount of work, but you'll only have half the time to do it. So at this point, if my little spiel hasn't scared you off running for an ad drop slip, you'll want to download the course syllabus from the Learning Management System if you haven't already done so. It will be saved in either a PDF or MS Word document file. And so for the next set of slides, we'll cover the highlights of the syllabus, giving particular detail to the textbooks that are assigned and the assignments that are required for successful completion of this course. So let's go back to our course description a bit, and let's see if we can define what some of the expectations will be for this class. In terms of Bloom's taxonomy, this class is what's known as a knowledge-based course. Issues of critical thinking, life application, and worldview synthesis will unfortunately have to take a back seat in this class so that I can cram as much knowledge into your head as humanly possible. Simply put, we have a mountain of data to cover in this short 8-week period, and by the time you are finished, you'll feel like you have drunk gallons and gallons of liquid knowledge straight from a fire hose. With this being said, there are specific types of knowledge I'm going to help you to acquire during this time. And the first type of knowledge is geographical knowledge. Students will become well acquainted with the maps of the ancient Near East, also known as the Levant. And they will be able to locate biblical sites, trade routes, geopolitical boundaries that are all relevant to the study of the Bible. And this will be tested via map quizzes and the students' ability to incorporate maps into their class projects. Now, the second type of knowledge you will acquire is what's known as chronological knowledge. Students will develop a comprehensive understanding of chronology to appropriately place biblical figures and the composition of biblical books into their proper frame of reference. And this will be tested by the student's ability to chart biblical errors and biblical persons of interest on a timeline. Next, the third form of knowledge you will receive is what's called historical knowledge. And for this, students will learn the basic parameters of salvation history, or the million-dollar German word for this, Heilsgeschichte. And we will explain how God has been an active agent throughout human history. Students will be able to explain how the Word of God, i.e. the Bible, is an inspired document accurately reporting God's interactions with human beings. And this will be tested via various objective and essay-style questions on the weekly quizzes. And the last type of knowledge you will master in this course is cultural knowledge of the ancient Near East. Students will become familiar with the cultural values, beliefs, and customs that made up the ancient Near Eastern worldview, and by extension, the worldview of the Bible. Special attention will be given to how the Israelites, as God's chosen people, fit into this cultural matrix through participation, i.e. the acceptance of the ancient Near Eastern worldview, and how they also fit into it via polemics, challenging that ancient Near Eastern worldview. And this will be tested also via quiz questions and the students' ability to integrate cultural knowledge into their final projects. So, since this is an online class, you will also have adequate time to express yourself and to develop your communication skills by answering discussion questions and posting your answers to the LMS Internet forums. Students will practice written communication with their peers on topics pertinent to the study of Bible backgrounds. And this will culminate in a final project where the students will produce a substantial video and possibly audio-visual presentation expounding on a specific biblical passage using the knowledge and methods we have taught here in this class. At the end of this orientation lecture, I will present you a modest example of what such a project could look like. And additionally, every week I will be introducing you to a wide variety of scholarly resources to help you do college-level work in the field of biblical studies. Students will become familiar with a wide assortment of biblical study aids and resources that are available both in electronic and in print formats. Throughout this course, students will be taught the proper use of such study aids and begin to develop critical assessment skills for determining what constitutes a good resource and what constitutes a bad resource for the study of the Bible. And this will be tested by how thoroughly a student is able to integrate those resources and other information about them into their final project. And so our final objective learning outcome will be the real-life test to see how you can juggle all of this information and put it together into a synthesis. In this course, students will be introduced to what's called the historical critical method of biblical interpretation. And students who successfully complete this course will be able to expound upon the axiom, the Bible is important to us today, but it was not written directly to us today. Students will furthermore be able to use their knowledge of geography, chronology, history, and culture to begin bridging some of those gaps between the ancient world of the Bible and our modern world today. But in addition to all of those objective learning outcomes, I also want to save time for spiritual formation. You see, I am also concerned that you are gaining knowledge, that you're also growing in your walk with Jesus Christ. And as a result, every week there will be several opportunities for you to see how the course material applies directly to your spiritual walk. And because spiritual growth is rather personal, and like salvation, I can't force you to pursue it, this learning outcome will not be tested or measured objectively, save that I hope that and pray that you'll find the portions of this class edifying, and that it will encourage your walk of faith. So now that you've got all those goals in mind, you're probably wondering, how are you going to get there from here? Well, the first and most important tool you can cultivate for this journey is a love of reading. For this course, I've assigned you 3 different textbooks, all totaling about 1,000 pages of reading. Now, while this would probably take me or your professor about a weekend to read, I'm not going to assume that you read at our pace. So, weekly readings from the textbook are assigned, and you will be averaging about 125 pages every week. And you'll do well to keep up with these readings because I'm going to try to pace the class so that your weekly readings will reinforce other things that you're learning during the class lectures. So let's shift gears and talk textbooks. Our primary textbook for the class is the Holman Bible Atlas by Thomas Briscoe. And this book has won numerous evangelical Christian awards for scholarship and quality. And it also just so happens that it comes with the Logos software that Dr. Fields requires for all of his Bible classes. So, if you already own a copy of the Logos software, you won't need to purchase this book. And a benefit of also having it on the Logos software is you can then search this book electronically, and specifically that you can search it topically, which will save you quite a bit of time when compared with having to check page numbers in the index if you have a hard copy. And so, each week, you'll have assigned readings from this book, and they'll be notated in your class notes and on your class syllabus like this. They'll say Briscoe, pages, and then it will list the page numbers you have to read for that week. So, our second text is entitled Ancient Near Eastern Thought in the Old Testament by John H. Walton. And this book deals with the rather complex discipline known as comparative Semitics. And simply put, the Bible was not the only type of literature that was being produced by the cultures of the ancient Near East, and some of the greatest challenges to traditional interpretations of the Bible have come from scholars who compare the biblical text to these ancient documents which were written by the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Canaanites, and others. Now, Walton is a fairly conservative Old Testament scholar, but he's also a master of much of this other ancient literature. And this book will help you see the connections clearly, both with regards to how the Bible is unique as a set of documents coming from that culture, and also how it is similar to other forms of ancient literature. Now, I'll need to stress this from the beginning. I do not agree with everything Walton says in this book, and I'm fairly certain you won't agree with everything either. I have assigned this book, though, because his scholarship is extremely thorough, and you'll find it eye-opening to see the directions that some of this evidence points. So I encourage you, read it critically, and I am certain that it will enlighten your reading of the Bible, and it will challenge you to rethink some of your assumptions about the Old Testament. And so thirdly, our final textbook for the class is a classic in every sense of the word. You see, about a generation after Jesus was crucified and raised from the dead, a Jewish man by the name of Josephus penned two of the most important historical accounts of the Jewish people, entitled Antiquities of the Jews and The Jewish Wars. For historians, these books form a necessary starting place for understanding the Jewish world of the New Testament era. In this book, Josephus discusses things like where the Pharisees and the Sadducees come from. He describes all of the reasons the Jews and the Samaritans didn't get along, and even discusses reasons why the Jews expected their Messiah to be a military leader who would be able to save them from the Romans and eventually defeat them militarily. Now, this book, which is edited and translated by Paul Meyer, is abridged, meaning that it's had a lot of stuff cut out. I did not assign you a full copy of Josephus because, one, an uncut version tends to be in Old English, and they're rather hard to read, and two, those translations tend to be upwards of 900 pages long. So, in respect for your time and your limited patience, I've directed you to a book that really kind of cuts to the chase for the important stuff that will help you to read the Bible better. So keep in mind that professional Bible scholars are largely expected to have read the unabridged version of Josephus multiple times. And so if you're considering a career in biblical studies, this book will provide you a gateway into the historiography of the New Testament age and will show you other things you should be reading as you progress. So let's shift gears once again and let's talk about the graded assignments as they appear in your syllabus. As I'm sure you could guess, since this class takes place online, there's no way for us to have a traditional lecture where the professor talks for 45 minutes and you can raise your hand and respond to those ideas. So to make up for this, our class will rely on discussion boards, which facilitate student-to-teacher and student-to-student dialogues. Participation in these forums is crucial to your learning experience, and failure to participate in 3 or more weeks will result in being dropped from the class. You will contribute one discussion forum per week, and you will respond to one of your peers' posts as well, also once per week. All totaled, this will account for about 10% of your final grade. Now, since this is a discussion, you will begin by answering a question which I have proposed. Normally, I will expect these responses to be somewhere around 250 to 350 words in length, or about a full typed page. This first post will be due on Wednesday night at 11:59, and you'll have a post due every Wednesday for the 8 weeks of the class. Now, since your peers are also answering this question, you are to read their posts as well, and you're going to respond to one of them every week. This peer response will be due on Sunday nights at 11:59 p.m., and it should be shorter, about 150 to 250 words long. So got that. Your initial response is due on Wednesday night every week. Your second response is due on Sunday night every week, and we'll repeat this process for all 8 weeks of the class. Now let's talk about the bulk of your grade, which will come from quizzes. As promised, this class is heavily oriented towards the acquisition of knowledge, and the best way to make sure that you're getting all of this is to quiz you regularly. So every week you will have a quiz. And each quiz is worth 5% of your grade, so I want you to take them very seriously, as a failed quiz can take you down a half a letter grade all by itself. Additionally, there's no cumulative final exam, so the quiz on the 8th week will be just like the first. It's only going to cover the material you learned that particular week. One quiz will be due every week on Friday nights at 11:59 p.m., and so you'll want to plan your study time accordingly. And furthermore, each quiz has a 35-minute time limit. And so you'll want to spend the bulk of your time answering the essay question, as that will take up the majority of your 35 minutes. So each quiz will be very uniform in structure. You'll be given one or more maps, and you'll be asked to identify 10 different marked areas. You'll need to make sure that you correctly match the correct site or geographical feature's name with the correct letter as it's marked on the map. Once you're done with the map section, you'll be given 10 multiple choice questions, and each of those questions will test your historical and cultural knowledge that you've garnered during the week. you'll want to pick up the option that is the best answer, i.e., some of the answers will be all of the above, which will imply choice A through C are correct, and some will be none of the above, meaning that none of the answers are good. Finally, the quiz will conclude with an essay question, and I would expect that your answers would be in complete sentences and that they'd be about 100 to 200 words in length. And these questions will test how well you've processed the information that you've received during the week. Next, in addition to the quizzes, we're going to have a few typed papers, and 2 of your assigned papers are going to be book reviews, specifically book reviews of Walton's Ancient Near Eastern Thought in the Old Testament and Meyer's translation of Josephus. And in these book reviews, you're going to draft a 3 to 4 page review. At about 250 to 300 words per page, each review is going to be about 900 to 1200 words in length. Since this is technically a history class, I'm going to require that these views be written in what is called the Chicago style or the Turabian style. And if you've never written in this format before, or if you are still unsure about what you can expect, you can download a Word document from the LMS entitled Sample Style Sheet for the Chicago Manual of Style. This document is a short sample of the Chicago style written by Dr. James North, and it will provide you with numerous insights for how to format a Turabian style paper correctly. Now, with regard to content, I'm not going to want you to spend all 3 to 4 pages telling me a summary of these books. Your professor will have read these books many times, and they already know what they say. What we're looking for, though, is a short summary highlighting the thesis and the goals of the book. This summary should take no more than a page, and then after that, you're going to want to analyze the book for 2 to 3 pages. In the analysis section, you're going to want to answer some of the following questions. Did the author accomplish the goals that they set forth? Was the logic of the author consistent throughout the book? Did the author make arguments that were convincing? If so, why were they convincing? What did you find compelling about them? And this is the level of interaction your professor will be expecting for each of your book reviews. So far we've got quizzes, we've got 2 writing assignments, but then we're going to have 2 projects. And the first project you're going to need to do is you're going to need to prepare a timeline of important biblical events. To help you out, I'm going to be sharing several timelines with the class so that you can get a feel for how to display chronological information graphically. The primary reason that this assignment exists is because for most people, the Bible was a book written a long time ago in a land very, very far away. And so numbers like 1446 BC have no real meaning to such people because they have yet to establish a framework for understanding how those numbers relate to them in the 21st century. And so for the 5th week of class, you too will produce a timeline, and that will help you to demonstrate the following factors. And the first of those factors is accuracy. Your timeline project will need to have accurate dates that can be confirmed by a scholarly source. And I understand that most study Bibles have timelines in them these days. But I don't want you to just take their word for it. I want you to be researching this for yourself. In some cases, you're going to have to take a guess. And when that happens, you're going to need to mark your timeline with a circa date. For example, circa 1805 BC. And this will let your professor know that you are aware that certain dates are not quite as exact as you would like them to be, and you're taking a best guess. And in particular, you're going to want to find dates for the following 10 events. 1. When Abraham was first given the covenant of circumcision, Genesis 17. 2. When Moses brought the 10 plagues on Egypt, Exodus chapter 7 through 12. 3. When Joshua burned the city of Hatzor, Joshua 11. 4. When Ruth converted to Naomi's religion, Ruth chapter 1. 5. When King Jeroboam built the altars in Dan and Bethel, 1 Kings 12. Number 6, when Isaiah predicted the end of the Syro-Ephraimitic War, which is found in Isaiah 7. Number 7, when Daniel and his friends went to Babylon as a prisoner, see Daniel chapter 1. And number 8, when Nehemiah rebuilt Jerusalem's wall, Nehemiah chapter 6. Number 9, you'll want to tell me when Jesus Christ died on the cross, Luke 23. And number 10, you're going to want to have a date for when Paul wrote the book of Galatians. You'll see Acts chapter 15 and Galatians chapter 2 for more information there. But on top of the accuracy, we're also going to explore history. And in particular, I want you to be finding and plotting 10 dates, specifically 10 dates for your professor, and these are going to be dates of your choosing. They can be any biblical event described in the New Testament, the Old Testament, or the Apocrypha, but you're going to want to space them out across your timeline. And so I'm requesting that when you pick these 10 events, you try to pick one event for each of the following eras. The Patriarchal era, from 2200 BC to 1805 BC. The era of Israelite captivity in Egypt, 1805 to 1446. The era of the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan, 1446 to 1350. The era of the Judges, 1350 to 1050 BC. The United Monarchy period, from 1050 to 930 BC. And then the Divided Monarchy period, from 930 to 586 BC. Followed after that will be the Judean Exilic period from 586 BC to 539 BC. Then the Post-Exilic period from 539 BC to 425 BC. And then what's called the Intertestamental period from 425 BC to 6 BC. And then finally the New Testament era, which spans all the way from 6 BC to 100 AD. So, in addition to giving historically accurate dates, you're also going to want to give relative distances with your timeline. You see, a good timeline doesn't just show dates, it shows how the dates react relative to one another. And your timeline won't be able to help too many people tell how far apart the dates are if it doesn't have a consistent use of scale. And so, for example, in the timeline that I provided here on the slide, a 10-year period is marked off in even increments. And your timeline should do the same. And if you want a good rule of thumb, I recommend about 1 inch equals 100 years. And that's a pretty good scale to use. It will roughly cover all of Israel's history and fit on a standard piece of poster board. Now, throughout this class, I'll be showing you several types of timelines. And it would be in your best interest to view a few of them before making your own. And this will give you a pretty good idea of what your professor is looking for as they go grading. In fact, I encourage you, go ahead and pause your video here and download the timeline entitled Israel's History Master Timeline from the LMS, and that will give you a pretty good idea of just what sort of scale we're looking at. And our final concern for the timeline is appearance or aesthetics. In addition to all of these other things, I'd like for your timeline to be appealing to look at so that you might want to use it in future teaching endeavors. And so you could lose as much as a letter grade if the timeline is sloppy, has too many mistakes, or it just looks like it was slapped together the night before it was due. And so in short, take some pride in your work. Your professor is hoping that you will make a timeline that is a resource that you'll be able to look at over and over again, and that you'll be able to use throughout your career as both a minister and as a student of the Bible. Now, after you've done all of that, there's one more thing that you need to do to finish out your timeline project. I would like you to include what's known as a works-cited bibliography of every book that you consulted in order to figure out those dates. And in particular, I want you to use at least 5 different sources, although I would not be surprised if the number was closer to 10 or 15 if you did this project well. And so, just like the other written assignments, you're going to need to use the Turabian format for this bibliography. Now, if you find yourself having trouble formatting your bibliography correctly, I suggest you can go to helpful websites such as easybib.com or https://owl.english.purdue.edu, and this will show you some proper formatting techniques for nearly any book that you can find. And so let me recap on this timeline project here. You'll want to make an attractive timeline of biblical events that show relative temporal distances that are consistently accurate. We're going to want you to find dates that are the 10 that we listed, and we're going to want you to find 10 more dates that are in the eras that we listed above. And then finally, we're going to want you to show your work by including a works cited page of all the resources that you consulted in order to build your timeline. And if this sounds like a lot of work, well, it is. But you can take some comfort in this reassurance. I believe that you can do it. And if it makes you feel any better, to design this course, I've had to make 7 timelines. And so while you're doing this, just remember, I'm not asking you to do anything that I've not already done myself many times. It means I'm right there with you. You're making a timeline. I've been making timelines. All right, so let's shift gears one last time and let's talk about the project at the end of the semester. At the end of the 8 weeks, I'm going to ask you to make a final exegetical project. And that will show me that you are successfully able to apply many of the things you're learning in class. And so you're going to want to start off by picking your text. And you can choose any one of the following passages. The first choice, Judges 16, 1 through 22, and that's the narrative of Samson and Delilah. Your second choice is 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 22, and that's the narrative of where David spares King Saul's life. Your third choice is Mark 7, 31 through 8:13, and this details Jesus' ministry in an area known as the Decapolis. And your fourth choice is Acts 23, 12 through 35, and this describes an event where Paul was transported as a prisoner to a place called Caesarea, and he's traveled there under very heavy guard. And so you'll have to pick one of those 4 possibilities, and you'll email your professor as soon as you've decided on which text you want to do. This will allow your professor to supply you with other resources and also potentially helpful advice on how best to do a project on that passage. And so if you haven't chosen your text by the end of the second week of class, your professor will assign you a text via email. So please, choose early and don't wait till the last week to start on this project. You won't have the time. So next, let's talk about how to submit that project. We want you to submit that project as a PowerPoint presentation. And this will be one of the major differences between the online version of GB102 Bible Backgrounds and the on-campus version of the class. Normally, Dr. Bob, who teaches the on-campus version, will have you all do some sort of a project that will require you to bring in some kind of substantial model or prop and demonstrate some cultural aspect of the biblical world. Well, since some of you are taking this class and you live several hundred miles away, just like me, coming to campus won't really be feasible. So instead, what we want you to do is we want you to explain your Bible passage using digital media that you can submit online. And you should take advantage of this format to use charts, graphs, pictures, and maps to help you illustrate the main points about your passage. Additionally, we'd like for you to organize your insights on your passage either chronologically or thematically. And, if possible, I want you to record your voiceover with the presentation, just like I'm doing here with this orientation lecture. Now, if you have an older computer or you just can't figure out how to do this, you've got a second choice. You can type out the script that you would have said in the notes section of your PowerPoint slides. And here's the good rule of thumb for that. If you want to type your notes, it'll be about 200 to 300 words per slide. 15 slides or so, and that'll give you about 30 minutes worth of presentational material. So let's talk about what needs to be in this project. The first thing you're going to want to have is a word study. In this study, you're going to want to use scholarly resources like concordance and theological dictionaries to help you and your audience understand important words and phrases in your chosen biblical text. And you also want to keep in mind that these type of resources can be somewhat limited in scope. So it may be helpful to check out a Bible commentary or two to confirm that the important words or idioms, also known as figures of speech, actually means what your concordance is suggesting they mean. Next, your project must include both what is called exegesis and exposition. And by this I mean that you must interpret what the original author meant in your chosen passage of Scripture by using what's known as the historical critical method of biblical studies. Now, if you don't know what that means just yet, don't panic. You will by the time this 8 weeks is over, because we're going to spend the next 8 weeks figuring out just how to properly do this thing called the historical critical method. But for now, it will suffice to say that I want you to begin gathering cultural and geographical facts about the biblical world that could help you build a bridge across the gap between yourself and the scriptural author of your passage. Then, once you have assessed the original meaning of your text, you'll want to make some real-life applications for yourself and for your culture today using that original meaning as a springboard. And this is what is often known as exposition. Now, this part of the project is the crux of the class, and I dare say the crux of your entire biblical education. The whole reason we want you to be able to read the Bible better is because we want you to responsibly use the Word of God to improve your relationship with Jesus Christ and to help shape Christ in the lives of yourself and your peers. And as a person who went to Bible college and as a Christian, you will be doing this process for the rest of your life. And so take time to master these skills, because I dare say you will be using them for many years to come, and they will serve you well if you learn them now. Additionally, your final project is going to need to include at least one map and show the movements of people as described in your chosen text. In this class, we're going to work very heavily with maps, but the focus will be on naming and locating major cities and other sites of interest. But the real test of map comprehension, however, is your ability to read a biblical passage and make assertions about human travel and movement based upon how well you know the geography and the lay of the land. And finally, just like your timeline project, I am requesting that you use a works-cited bibliography of at least 5 sources. And that bibliography should also be formatted in the Turabian or Chicago Manual of Style, and it may be submitted either as an independent document or it can be embedded on the last slide of your PowerPoint presentation. And yes, you may use some of those resources that you used on your timeline project for your final project as well. There will be some overlap, I guarantee it. So now, take a deep breath. That's going to be a lot of work for this semester. This last project itself can be very time-consuming, so don't be overwhelmed. And as the designer of this course, just know that I and your professor are here to help you succeed. To accomplish this, I'm going to give you one example per week of what a successful final project might look like. It'll be at the very end of all of our lecture materials. And this will help me demonstrate to you what all your professor is going to be looking for. And it will also help us to model proper forms and techniques as you go along. And so keep in mind that for the next 15 minutes, we're going to give an example of what a final project may look like. And I just want you to just settle back and hear this message from God's holy word as it's found in 2 Kings chapter 5. Good day. I'd like to start off this presentation today by having you open your Bibles to the book of 2 Kings chapter 5. Now, for most of us, this is a fairly well-known story. I know I remember hearing it when I was in elementary school, and I'd be willing to wager that if you grew up in the church at all, you already know the gist of how the story goes. This is the story of Naaman the Syrian, or Aramean as some translations will call him. He's a man with leprosy who God miraculously heals when he demonstrates his faith in the word of the Lord. Well, that's the basics of the story, but let me just kind of blow your mind right off the bat by asserting this. If this story does not offend you, you may have been reading it wrong. And my proof for this comes from Jesus' own ministry as it's recorded in the Gospel of Luke. In Luke chapter 4, Jesus is quoted as saying this, quote, "And there were many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha. Yet none of them was cleansed except for Naaman the Syrian." Unquote. And when they heard this, all of the people of the synagogue were filled with rage, and they got up and they forced him out of town. They brought him to the brow of a hill on which their town was built, and so that they could throw him down off the cliff. That sounds pretty brutal there, doesn't it? Not the kind of reaction you expect when someone goes out preaching. Well, or at least it's not the reaction I expect when I go out preaching. No one has tried to kill me yet. But keep this idea in the back of your mind. This passage about Naaman, when properly interpreted, should cause people of faith to get just a little bit edgy. So let's begin by asking, what is a Syrian? Or, I think more to the point, what was the opinion of the average Israelite of the Syrians in the 8th century BC? Well, the simple answer to this is, it's not a good opinion at all. For example, a Syrian artifact that's known as the Tel Dan Stela records that the king of Syria, a man named Hazael, in 841 BC invaded the northern territories of Israel and destroyed many of their cities, and he made the people pay tribute, which is basically protection money, to keep Hazael from destroying even more cities. Hazael also claims to have been a major player in the deaths of King Jehoram of Israel and King Ahaziah of Judah, an event that the Bible itself attributes to Jehu, the usurper king of Israel. And in addition to this, the prophet Elisha predicts the damage that Hazael will do when he predicts this. He says, quote, "Because I know the trouble you will cause to the Israelites. You will set fire to their fortresses. You will kill their young men with the sword. You will smash their children to bits, and you will rip open their pregnant women." Unquote. In short, the average Israelite would have probably called the Syrians terrorists if they had lived in our day and age. They were the kind of people that would attack you for no good reason. They would take your stuff, they would kill your children and your wife, and they'd burn your house down. Now, I'm saying this as dramatically as I can so that I hope you're starting to generate a strong dislike for this kind of a person. Because that's exactly how the original Israelite audience would have reacted reading this book of 2 Kings. They would have heard the term Syrian, and they would have gotten angry, defensive, possibly even irate. So now let's turn our attention to Naaman himself. 2 Kings 5 records it this way. Now Naaman was the commander of the king of Syria's army, and he was esteemed and respected by his master, for through him the Lord had given Syria military victories. But this great warrior had a skin disease. Now raiding parties went out from Syria and took captives from the land a young Israelite girl who became a servant to Naaman's wife. Unquote. And this is where the main character of our Bible passage becomes implicated in the problem that is Syria. As the commander of the Syrian army, he had already taken part in raiding parties, and he'd even made a slave out of at least one of the Israelite people, and presumably more. And I find it notable that the parents of this young girl are not mentioned in this text. Did Naaman and his men kill them on one of their raids? Was she simply captured while her parents were still in Israel and they're wondering what happened to her? Another problem, is her slavery only manual labor? Or is she being sexually abused, as was often the case with slaves taken during this time? Simply put, if Naaman were a person doing this kind of thing today in our culture, he would be the equivalent of the antagonist from the movie Taken, with the only exception that this poor little girl doesn't have a Liam Neeson character as a father to single-handedly destroy the Syrian army. But we also learn something else about Naaman from this passage. He has a skin disease. The word in this passage is the Hebrew word metzora, and it's the passive form of the verb tsara, which means to be struck with a skin disease. There's quite a lot of debate about what kind of skin-related problem Naaman actually suffered from, as this word can apply to a wide variety of skin afflictions in the same way that our word cancer can describe both malignant and benign tumors. In the best-case scenario, Naaman has a disease probably like eczema, in which case his skin would have turned red, itchy, and possibly scaly in the affected areas. But worst case scenario, he would have had what was called Hansen's disease, or leprosy. Now, most modern Bible translations choose to go with this worst case scenario, as Hansen's disease is life-threatening, and it gives Naaman more of a reason to travel to a distant land to find a cure. But there's also a second possibility why Naaman is so urgent in his search for a cure, and that has to do with the ancient Near Eastern ideas of purity. For example, in the biblical book of Leviticus, a person who contracts a skin disease, and if it can't be cured after 7 days, that person has to live in isolation away from the people just in case, so they won't give the disease to anyone else. And furthermore, such a person who gets a disease like this, they had to burn any of their clothing that showed signs of contamination, and such a person couldn't be allowed in the temple at all to worship. And some commentators assume that Naaman is also prohibited from worshiping at the temple of Rimmon in Damascus. That would be his god, because of his skin disorder as well. Now, a final issue associated with this word of skin disorders is that it was often taken as a sign from God that God was punishing a person for their sins. This happens in the case of Miriam in Numbers chapter 12, and in the case of Gehazi later in this text in 2 Kings 5. However, God's displeasure with Naaman is really hard to decipher from this text, because the opening verse suggests that Israel's God himself was actually helping Naaman secure his victories. And this would have probably left the original audience a little confused. Was God immediately punishing Naaman for his sins, even though at the exact same time he's using Naaman as an instrument of God's wrath against Israel? Well, the text leaves this question open to speculation. But in all likelihood, the original audience of this book would have heard that this Syrian, who, quite frankly, was in the business of raiding Israelite villages and killing their people and taking slaves, he had contracted a skin disease. And their most likely reaction would have been to say, "Good, I hope his skin rots and falls off his body for all the harm he's done to us." So, let's talk about Naaman's travels here. After his Israelite slave tells him that there's a prophet in Samaria who could cure him, Naaman immediately goes to the king, who gladly gives him permission to travel to Samaria. Now, Naaman takes some money along to help pay for his healing. In particular, he brings 10 talents of silver, 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. And, well, the question for us today is, well, really, how much did this amount of money weigh? And I'm going to suggest that a good rule of thumb is that 1 talent weighs about 75 to 85 pounds. And this means that Naaman is bringing about 800 pounds of silver and possibly another 50 to 200 pounds of gold, depending on how big those gold pieces actually are. The clothing, in case you're curious, probably weighed as much as a full laundry basket. So, in short, he has about half a ton of metal that he's carrying with him. And it may be worth keeping in mind that King Omri paid 2 talents of silver to buy a whole mountain where he built the capital city of Samaria on. We're talking a lot of money. And another potentially abrasive fact is that this gold and silver was probably taken from the Israelites in Naaman's raids. And so we're really discussing kind of a horrific triangular trade route. Naaman steals from the Israelites. He then brings the money back into Israel to pay for a disease he's contracted. So let's talk about this half a ton of metal some more, because unless you use that metal and turn it into a transformer, it isn't going to walk itself from Damascus to Samaria. And a half a ton of metal isn't easy to hide either. So odds are Naaman had to load all this treasure onto either donkeys or mules, and then he would probably need an armed escort of soldiers just to keep it all safe. So picture this, if you will. We have 10 to 20 donkeys carrying bags of gold and silver, and probably 10 to 50 armed guards, including several other slaves, traveling behind this man who's got this horrible skin disease. So now that you've got that picture in your mind of what Naaman's entourage looks like, let's see how far that money had to move or travel. Starting in Damascus, where Naaman's king lived, Naaman would have traveled downhill along the international coastal highway through the highlands of a place called Bashan. And he'd go south around the imposing summit of Mount Hermon. And once around Hermon, his road would have dropped steeply about 2,000 feet in elevation into the Hula Basin, where he'd finally arrive at the city of Dan. And this is the northernmost part of Israel in her history. It's about a 50-mile journey so far. Now, from Dan, Naaman and his company would have had to turn south along the rim of the Hula Basin. The inner part of the basin was way too swampy to accommodate safe travel. So, luckily for Naaman, this whole area is a fairly flat stretch of about 38 miles. He would run past the ruins of Hatzor, and he would continue along fairly flat ground until he passed the Sea of Galilee. But too bad for Naaman, that last leg of his journey is going to be the hardest. Samaria, the city itself, rests on a high ridge high above the Jezreel Valley. So to get there from the Sea of Galilee, Naaman would have had to cross the valley to Megiddo, turn south along the Central Ridge route, and from there he would have had to travel uphill past the cities of Ibleam, Dothan, and finally, after 128 miles of traveling, he would arrive at the city of Samaria. And odds are this kind of a journey with non-engine-powered vehicles would have lasted about 2 to 3 weeks. So when Naaman finally gets to Samaria, he delivers a letter to the king, King Jehoram, the king of Israel. Jehoram is the son of the evil king Ahab, and the text of 2 Kings makes every attempt to show that Jehoram is just as faithless as his father was. Now, he's going to read Naaman's letter, and he's going to rip his clothes as a sign of mourning. And he's going to basically say that this must be an attempt from the king of Syria to provoke a war. Now, it is customary to pick on Jehoram for his lack of faith, but for a moment, try to put yourself in his place. Here's Naaman, a man who had been brutally attacking his people, shows up on his doorstep with somewhere between 10 to 50 armed guards, and he's got a letter saying, "Heal me of a skin disease that no one knows a cure for." I agree. Jehoram did not see this situation through the eyes of faith. But I dare say that most people living today would have probably seen things Jehoram's way as well. So now you're probably asking, well, why didn't Naaman go to Elisha's house directly? Why did he stop to see the king at all? Well, there could be 2 reasons for this. The first is that Naaman's slave girl has told him that the prophet lives in Samaria, which is both a region and a town, kind of like how in the United States we have New York State, and the smaller New York City, which is inside New York State. He may have just simply assumed incorrectly that she meant the city instead of the region. The other possibility, though, is that Naaman may have mistaken how prophets functioned in Israel. You see, in most of the ancient Near East, the job of a prophet was to support the king and legitimize his reign. In short, where Naaman comes from, the prophets are the king's servants, and it's their job to make the king look good. It's their job to tell the king exactly what he wants to hear from the gods. In Israel, though, true prophets were often antagonistic to kings, unless they followed God's law very well. So, Naaman may have gone to see the king, figuring that any prophet with any real power would just be in the king's service. Well, in either case, he guessed wrong. And as a result, King Jehoram proved to be very little help to him. Now, it's at this point that Elisha saves the day and agrees to meet with Naaman. The text states that Naaman rides out to Elisha's house with his servants and his chariot. The chariot, which is the Hebrew word rekev, was the premier war machine of the 8th century BC. These 2-wheeled vehicles were often pulled by 2 to 4 horses, and they served as armored platforms for shooting arrows. In short, Naaman has just pulled up to the prophet's house in the 8th century BC equivalent of a tank or fighter jet. And we're talking both in terms of cost, how much it costs to make one, and in terms of awesomeness, how it tends to put peasants in their place. And anyone watching could have seen that a very important person has just come to see Elisha. Now, Elisha seems to be highly unimpressed, and so he sends his servant out to tell Naaman to go wash 7 times in the Jordan River. Burn! Naaman just came all this way, and the prophet won't even give him the time of day to step out of his house and say hello. Now, the original audience of this text at this moment is probably overjoyed that here is this bad Syrian coming in his bad old chariot, and he just totally gets disrespected by the prophet. Now, at this point, most of us usually feel like Naaman has become a chronic whiner. Elisha tells him to go wash 7 times in the Jordan River, and most of us would probably think, well, how hard can that be? Well, before you pass judgment, picture this. The 25-mile trip from Samaria to the Jordan requires travel through some pretty gnarly terrain. In fact, Naaman must follow the Wadi Farah, which at this time is probably a dry riverbed this time of year, for about 25 miles, and it's a drop of nearly 4,000 feet in elevation. This is a drop of 1,000 feet every 7 miles or so. And that's a nasty descent by anyone's standards, even today. Additionally, the Jordan River literally means the down goer. It goes downhill so fast, it picks up tons of sediment and debris, and as a result, it's a very, very muddy river. And Naaman is right when he complains that Damascus has much better and cleaner rivers than Israel does. Quite frankly, it does. And sadly, even though it's a longer trip mileage-wise, going back the way he came from may have been an easier route than taking all of his equipment and material and traveling downhill to the Jordan River. So, predictably, Naaman tries to walk off angry and in a huff. But then his servants remind him of a different perspective. They tell him that Elisha has not asked him to do something difficult, well, besides to haul half a ton of gold and silver down a 5,000-foot ravine. But other than that, in the ancient world, the mark of a great hero was often the willingness to go on an epic quest to achieve the desires of their heart. For example, in the Babylonian epics, a man named Gilgamesh is credited with questing basically to the ends of the earth to find the secrets of immortality. Naaman's servants remind him that he was willing to prove his mettle by doing something hard. So, they ask, why not do something easy? So, now the question I would ask is, why all this rigmarole for poor old Naaman? Well, my guess is this. Naaman needed to have an encounter with Israel's God. You see, if Elisha had simply touched him and prayed for him, as Naaman had expected, he may have attributed his healing to Elisha's superior magic, and not necessarily to the power of Elisha's God. Likewise, if the river was the cleaning agent, then Naaman may have attributed his healing to the clean water if he'd been told to go to a respectable river. By asking Naaman to get into the dirtiest river around, there's only one cause that could account for his healing: the God of Israel. And finally, washing 7 times required Naaman to exercise his faith. The text says nothing happened on the first 6 washes, and so presumably the first 6 times he dips himself has no effect whatsoever. It seems that only on the 7th dip, the 7th washing, is Naaman cured. Now, once he's healed, in an interesting twist, Naaman returns and attempts to offer Elisha the handsome reward that he was prepared to give in the first place. And Elisha turns it down, only telling Naaman to go in peace. And I'll be honest, this has always been a baffling statement to me. Why did Elisha tell Naaman why didn't he say, you need to become circumcised and become an Israelite? Why didn't Elisha condemn Naaman for his willingness to compromise on his faith? You know, he asked, is it okay if I bow in the temple of Rimmon when my king asked me to do it? Why doesn't Elisha tell him that, instead of giving me money, why don't you return your poor slave girl back to her parents? But you notice what happens. At best, Elisha only tells Naaman to go home a peaceful man. And at worst, he blesses him and to leave in peace, and he asks nothing further from him. And so, this, my friends, is the brutal scandal of God's grace. It meets us where we are. It deals with our own sin and suffering on our own level. And it heals us even though we ourselves are unworthy. But the most scandalous aspect of all, that would have been at least to the original audience when they read the story, is this. Here is Naaman, a terrorist, a slaver, a slave-trading kidnapper, at least the eyes of the original audience. And not only does God heal him, but he leaves with God's blessing without even being told, and now you have to follow the law of Moses. So, for us in the New Testament age, this both demonstrates the depths of God's grace, but it also challenges us to ask this question: who then can be saved? This text compels us to an answer that anyone, even a terrorist, even a slaver, even someone worse than this, can be apprehended by the grace and mercy of God. And I would like to suggest this is why the people of Nazareth became so upset at Jesus' message. He preached that God's grace could touch anyone, even the most despicable sinners imaginable. And the question for us is this: will we be willing to offer that sort of forgiveness? Will we go out of our way to preach the gospel to those who hate us, to those who would murder our families, to those who would kidnap our children? The God we worship has had mercy on those kind of people in the past, and He continues to have mercy on such people today. Therefore I tell you, go and do likewise. Hey, this program was brought to you by Alfred Howarth, Gerald Matley, and Edward Yamauchi in their book, The People of the Old Testament World. This was also brought to you by William L. Holliday and his concise Hebrew-Aramaic lexicon. This was brought to you by K.A. Kitchen and on the reliability of the Old Testament. Also brought to you in part by Wilhelm van Gemeren and his New International Dictionary of the Old Testament. And finally brought to you by John H. Walton, Ancient Near Eastern Thought and the Old Testament World. Thank you very much and have a good night, and may God's grace go with you.